And there you have it. Alex got himself in trouble with those little petty bureaucrats over asking questions about the United Nations. But what are we talking about here with these biosphere programs and the rest of it? We have a few articles to help point to that. The first, I believe, is Man and the Biosphere Program off of UNESCO's website, defining the program that started in 1971, 40 years out now. And it's an intergovernmental scientific program aiming to set a scientific basis for the improvement of the relationships between people and the environment globally. Sounds nice and friendly and like they want to protect wildlife. By the way, the UNESCO founder, Julian Huxley, worked with Prince Philip and Prince Bernhard, the Bilderberg founder, and also a member of the Nazi Party to fund the World Wildlife Fund, which also works in concert with these groups. Now, who owns our biospheres and World Heritage sites? This is an article from Michael S. Kaufman, PhD. He's pretty much the leading figure when it comes to the takeover of American lands based on biological diversity. He first found out when he attended the Convention on Biological Diversity and really began to uncover the bankers' plan behind this takeover. You saw him in an Endgame, and I refer you to that for even more information on the Agenda 21 takeover and the attempt to confine human activity. But among other things, he says one only has to look at the Champlain Adirondack Biosphere Reserve in Vermont and New York to see how this would work. A parallel concept has actually been implemented since 1972 with the Adirondack State Park by New York State. Instead of the robust, thriving communities promised in USMAB literature, that's Man in the Biosphere Program, the Adirondack economy has been devastated, culture and much of the infrastructure frozen in time, and the people repressed by a communal feudal land tenure structure where a non-elected, non-represented, NGO-controlled Adirondack Park Agency develops and enforces arbitrary and capricious regulations across multiple countries. And he gets into that after explaining how, yes, the United States did constitutionally agree to the World Heritage Treaty in 1972, as misguided as it may have been, as the Senate has powers over international treaties, but Congress never passed any law related to UNESCO's International Biosphere Program, which began its first convention back in 1968, if I'm not mistaken. So basically, through executive orders and complicity in our own government, we have signed on to this international management, and yet it still affects us all. Now, in this article, United Nations Biosphere Reserve Land Grabs, published by Spy Witness News back in September 2009, it just highlights a little of the things that you may find off-putting about United Nations control. For instance, what do the Statue of Liberty, Independence Hall, and Monticello have in common? What about the Great Smoky Mountains, Yellowstone Park, and the Grand Canyon? Would it surprise you to learn that every one of these unique American landmarks is also controlled by the United Nations? And it gets into more detail about the 72 World Heritage Treaty and the 68 UNESCO Biosphere Conference. It's amazing but true. Every one of the natural and historic treasures listed above, plus more than a dozen more in America, has been designated an official World Heritage Site by the United Nations Education, Scientific, and Culture Organization, UNESCO, headquartered in Paris, France. And there's a map just of those 20-some-odd World Heritage Sites. There's another 47 MAB Biosphere Reserve directory. But that is not all. There is also the International Union for Conservation of Nature and Natural Resources Organization, who put together the United Nations list of protected areas. This one is printed from 1997. They've been compiling this list since the early 60s and working on the biosphere designation since 1959 through various United Nations holding subcommittees. Now, this 1997 report lists about 12,000 protected sites throughout the world, including many in the United States. That's what's printed in this manual. And just for instance, I'll turn to Texas since I am familiar with many of those locations. And they get into all the different protected areas, and it is not just national parks. It also includes national forest. It includes national grasslands, natural landmarks, national parks, of course, in this case, Big Bend and Guadalupe Mountains National Parks. It includes national preserves. It includes national recreation areas. It includes national scenic rivers. It includes national seashores, such as the Padre Island National Seashore, really a very large area. It also includes the national wildlife refuges in Texas and all the other states listed here. It includes state natural area reserves and at least a dozen state parks, including near to Austin, the Bastrop State Park, Pedernales Falls State Park, and the others on this list. It also includes wilderness forest service areas and more. And so that's 12,000 sites. That site list was updated in 2003, where it jumped from 12,754 sites on the 1997 list. I don't know if you could see this right here, to 2003, when more than 68,000 protected areas were listed with the IUCN in United Nations Protected Areas list. Such a large list that they couldn't even publish the actual locations. They're on a CD-ROM. Now, it's important to point out that this United Nations list of protected areas expanded from 12,000 sites to more than 68,000. They have different categories for the reasons they're managing the areas. It includes managed and maintained mainly for science, Category 1A, maintained mainly for wilderness protection, Category 1B, maintained for ecosystem and recreation, i.e. national parks, Category 2, maintained because it's a national monument, Category 3, to Category 4, where there's habitat and species management areas protected for conservation. And that becomes important because of stuff like this, Executive Order 13112, which defines protection for invasive species. However, many scholars have realized that the vague definition of invasive species can and has been used to curb human and domestic animal activity, i.e. reining in human population as well as its industry and agriculture, because it could include everything from domesticated livestock to pets, houseplants, front lawns, neighborhood golf courses, food crops, and even that adaptive resilient species known as Homo sapiens. And so the Invasive Species Council is the type of entity that could use Category 4 habitat species management area, as they want to, as I pointed out before, under Agenda 21, concentrate the human populations. Again, that's something that Michael Kaufman, the expert, gets into. You also have Category 5, protected landscapes and seascapes, mainly for conservation and recreation. Then they point out, since 1997, they added Category 6, managed resource protected area managed mainly for the sustainable use of natural ecosystems. So there you have areas set aside just for so-called sustainability, a very important buzzword to all these United Nations treaties, from the 1992 Rio meeting and treaty to the Convention on Biological Diversity that Michael Kaufman covers, to the Agenda 21 stuff. And this other article out of Spy Witness talks about how the Global Biodiversity Assessment is 1,140 pages, Agenda 21's 300 pages, Our Global Neighborhood is 410 pages, and that's just a few of the agreements that outline this emerging international law based around sustainability and wildlife management that will have grave consequences on the development of human society. That is, in essence, why this is so important. That's why Alex covers it in his America Destroyed by Design film, as well as the seminal Endgame film. Now, some of the other executive orders that have been passed to help with this include the 1997 Executive Order 13061, which officially established the American Heritage Rivers Initiative that allows the federal government to take control of large parcels of land adjacent to U.S. rivers. And it was just recently we interviewed people on how they're forcing flood insurance and allowing things like hydroelectric dams to take over all kinds of privately owned land near U.S. rivers. And again, they have the primary core zones where, for instance, a national park would be completely restricted for whatever reason, whatever category they put it into. But then there is a buffer zone and an extended zone outside of that buffer zone that you heard the woman in the America Destroyed by Design clip refer to, that allows these United Nations-related environmental groups to clamp down and restrict human activity in the buffer zone and the extended zone. For instance, Kaufman breaks down how Yellowstone Park and the so-called danger to that park allowed them to close a coal mine that operated 150 years before the establishment of that park, and also allowed them to consider the park in danger because it has too many visitors, too many tourists. That's the kind of stuff you're going to see. And by the way, it was these same robber baron groups, from the Rockefellers to the Harrimans, that worked with people like the Sierra Club founder John Muir to set up these national parks in the first place. It was always about a land grab and what was then federal power, now world government powers. And there's a lot more to cover there, but we're going to draw the line, I think, except for this executive order, which is 12986, the International Union for Conservation of Nature and Natural Resources, where it outlines immunity for all these international groups as they work on these biosphere areas. It makes them immune from property seizure, and it makes them immune from search and confiscation and from interference of all kind, basically giving them total jurisdiction over these areas that have been declared biospheres. You don't believe me? I gave you the documents. You look it up, and there's a whole lot more, too. We should get Michael Kaufman back on soon. Hopefully that's something Alex will see to. Now, we have other news, too, but just as a segue, I want to remind you of the article that came out in June of 2011 in the Wall Street Journal, and that is "Want to Buy a Piece of Greek Island." Now, on the one hand, you have the European debt crisis and the austerity moves where they're trying to sell off infrastructure, and thus this, where they want to auction off $42 billion in public property, namely choice Greek islands, and sell them to private investors. You saw how in Italy they're being accused of selling public